Welcome to Stories by Jackson. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to encourage me to keep creating more amazing stories. Now, let's delve into the story. Lila Mae Dawson's name lived in the mouths of others like a riddle no one cared to solve. In the town of Willow Creek, where wind carried secrets through cornfields and screen doors slammed like punctuation marks in everyday conversations, her story began long before most folks knew what to do with it. The land itself seemed to carry memory in its bones. You could almost hear it groan under the weight of those who dared to dream past its fences. Lila was born on a muggy August morning when the sun rose late and sweat clung to skin before the day had even opened its eyes. Her parents, Samuel and Anna Dawson, were simple people with calloused hands and heavy hearts. They lived in a house stitched together with salvaged wood, tin, and hope, just beyond the town's edge where the gravel thinned into soil and the mailman stopped coming. Samuel worked the local rail line before it shut down, while Anna sold baked goods out of their kitchen to anyone willing to pay or offer trade. They didn't own much, but they raised Lila with more love than most children born into better homes. It was a quiet love, the kind shown in packed lunches, late-night humming, and the way Samuel always tightened the bolts on her bike wheels before she rode it into town. But tragedy didn't care how much love sat at a table. On a rain-slick night when Lila was 15, the Dawsons' old Buick lost control on Old Creek Road. Samuel died at the scene, Anna days later. And with that, Lila's name was no longer just hers. It became an echo attached to silence, a sort of sympathy people nodded toward but no longer wanted to hold. After the funeral, the casseroles came. Not because people cared, but because casseroles were easier than conversations. The church ladies left them on the porch, always covered in foil, always accompanied by little notes with verses or awkward apologies. No one asked her how she was sleeping. No one came inside. People in Willow Creek had a way of walking around pain like it might stain their shoes. And so, the girl who once rode her bike down the hill with her arms stretched wide now walked to town with her head low, her heart stitched together with thread no one could see. She kept the house barely. The bills came like wolves, and Lila found work wherever she could. Cleaning stalls, scrubbing porches, even hauling manure for the Morgan family's horse barn. At night, she sat in the shed behind the house where Samuel used to tinker with radios and tools. Something in the quiet there called to her, and she began picking up where he left off, learning to fix engines, rewire machines, understand how things broken could hum again if you just listened right. What began as necessity soon bloomed into passion. She started repairing old lawn mowers, chainsaws, even the neighbors' rust-bitten pickups. The tools she used were hand-me-downs, the kind with splinters in their grips and handles worn thin by decades of work. She carried them to town in a wooden wheelbarrow, the same one Anna once used to gather firewood. It squeaked and leaned, its wheel fighting the earth beneath it, but it held everything she had to offer. Folks laughed when they saw her coming. They'd never seen a girl in grease-stained overalls pushing a wheelbarrow full of alternators past the bakery and the feed store. Children pointed. Old men snickered. The name Wheelbarrow Girl followed her like smoke, ugly and hard to shake. She bore it in silence, not because it didn't hurt, but because she'd learned early that pain didn't care for an audience. There was no sense explaining yourself to people who'd already decided you were less than they were. Brent Callahan was one of the few who saw her before the whispers started. He was 2 years older, all denim and attitude, the kind of boy whose laugh made girls forgive things they shouldn't. He worked at Carl's garage, liked his music loud and his praise louder, and had a smile that felt like a promise. They started talking one summer when she brought in a weed whacker with a busted pull cord. He teased her gently, eyes lit with mischief. "You fix this yourself?" he asked. Didn't think girls touched machines unless they were sewing. She didn't flinch. Machines don't care what you look like. They care if you listen. That was all it took. He started stopping by her shed, sometimes bringing busted parts, sometimes just bringing himself. She didn't know what it meant to be loved by someone yet, but she knew how it felt to have someone choose you in a world that usually passed you by. Brent didn't mind the grease under her nails or the way she muttered to herself when she was deep in thought. He said she had a spark, something different. He told her she was going places, big places, and that he wanted to go with her. For a while, she let herself believe it. She sketched out ideas in her notebooks, dreams of her own garage, her own custom vehicles. And when he kissed her under the rusted windmill near the Dawson property, she tucked that moment into her chest like a warm stone. But even warm stones cool down. By the time autumn rolled around, Brent was drifting like smoke through her life, still there, but thin and hard to catch. He'd stopped bringing parts by the shed. He stopped answering her calls right away. He started spending more time at the diner, where the booths had red leather seats, and Marcy Lane served coffee with an extra helping of lipstick. Marcy wasn't cruel by nature, but she liked attention like flowers liked sun. And Brent, never one to say no to admiration, started lingering after his meals. When Lila asked him about it, he brushed her off with a shrug. "She's just friendly," he said. "You're reading too much into things." But Lila had a mechanic's mind. She knew the signs of something loosening long before it broke apart. One Friday evening, she wrapped up early and walked into town with a fresh tomato sandwich in wax paper, his favorite. She pushed the wheelbarrow behind her, rattling and wheezing as always, and when she reached Carl's garage, the laughter reached her before the door did. She peeked inside and saw Brent, leaning over Marcy, hand on her hip, lips too close. The moment stretched like elastic. Marcy looked up and saw her first. "Well, if it isn't Rosie the Riveter," she said, voice thick with mockery. Brent turned, saw the sandwich in Lila's hand, and winced like he'd stepped on a memory. "Lila," he started, but she didn't stay to hear it. She turned without a word, without a tear, and pushed that damn wheelbarrow all the way home. Lila didn't cry that night, not even when the door of her shed groaned shut behind her and the quiet settled over her shoulders like a wool blanket too heavy for spring. The moon hung low and swollen, casting silver across the cracked concrete floor where her tools lay scattered like forgotten prayers. She didn't light a lamp. She didn't need one. Her fingers found the edge of her workbench in the dark and leaned there, her breath shallow, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. What had cut her the deepest wasn't the betrayal. She'd seen that coming the way you see clouds gather before a storm, but the laughter. That sound, so careless and cruel, echoed louder than any goodbye. She stared at the wheelbarrow resting just inside the doorway. Its wheel was still turning slightly from the trip home, like it hadn't yet realized the journey was over. It had carried her tools, her groceries, her hope, and tonight it had carried the last of her illusions. The sandwich she'd made for Brent was still in her pocket, crushed and damp tomato juice bleeding through the paper. She took it out and placed it on the bench, not out of nostalgia, but because even a ruined thing deserved a place to rest. She stood there for a long time, unmoving, her thoughts turning over slowly like stones in a river. The truth settled into her bones not with fire, but with weight. There would be no rescue. No knight in shining armor, no returned affections, no fairy tale ending waiting in someone else's hands. If she wanted a future, she'd have to forge it herself, piece by piece, gear by gear, with nothing but grit and the ghosts of those who once believed in her. The next morning came without ceremony. The rooster crowed down the road like it always did, oblivious to heartbreaks and broken sandwiches. Lila got up before the sun fully stretched across the fields, her limbs stiff but her mind sharp in a new, unfamiliar way. The ache in her chest had cooled into something steadier, resolve. Not the loud kind that comes with speeches and fists, but the silent, bone-deep kind that made a woman dangerous to underestimate. She boiled water, washed her face, tied her hair back. The same motions she'd done 1,000 mornings before now carried a different weight. She walked out to the shed with her notebook tucked under one arm and the box of her father's old tools under the other. That notebook had once held doodles, casual sketches of gears and motors, dreams outlined in soft pencil. But now, the pages would become blueprints, not for repair, but for reinvention. She started drawing, fierce, focused lines, measuring ratios and calculating stress points with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to build. She wasn't just going to fix cars anymore. She was going to build her own, not replicas, not models. Original designs tailored for people who needed reliability more than luxury. vehicles that could survive gravel roads and stubborn seasons. She studied her father's schematics, annotated his margins, and reimagined what had once been good enough into something that could change her life. She no longer cared who laughed. Let them. Let them laugh until their throats were raw. Because while they laughed, she'd be working. And someday they'd choke on their own underestimation. Her days grew longer, stretched thin by sweat and silence. She scavenged scrap metal from junkyards, traded repairs for parts, and began piecing together her first prototype on the floor of that leaning shed. She used what she had, leftover frames, mismatched tires, wires stripped from retired tractors, and carved the rest with her own ingenuity. Her hands blistered, then hardened. Her arms grew lean and strong. She dropped pounds from missed meals and gained muscle from hauling iron. Mr. Clemens, an old widower who once taught shop class before the school board, cut his program, wandered by one evening as she was adjusting a torque wrench in the dying light. He stood by the fence, watching for a long while without saying a word. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "You're doing it wrong." She blinked at him, unsure whether to snap or sob. He walked over, knelt beside her, and showed her how to calibrate the timing belt. And that was that. Mr. Clemens began showing up twice a week, always in suspenders and with the stubborn gait of someone who'd wrestled both machines and life. He never pitied her. He never asked about Brent. He only brought tools and his time, both of which meant more to Lila than any apology ever could. They didn't talk much, just worked side by side the way people do when words aren't needed. And under his quiet guidance, her confidence began to stretch its wings. The vehicle, no longer just a hope, took shape. Its engine purred low and steady. Its frame sat higher than most trucks, reinforced for uneven roads. It wasn't pretty, but it looked like it could outlive a storm. When she started it for the first time and heard it roar, something inside her finally, fully, woke up. She didn't take the vehicle into town right away. She didn't crave their attention anymore. She tested it on the back roads, through the thickets behind the farm, past the creek where her mother used to collect wild mint. She let the wheels crush mud, grip gravel, skim across dry grass. The wind against her face was nothing like what she remembered from childhood. Back then, riding her bike down the hill had made her feel free. But this was sovereignty. She wasn't a passenger in someone else's dream anymore. She was the engine, the wheels, the road. When she finally did drive it into town weeks later, quietly, without announcement, she parked it by the feed store and went in to buy bolts. The usual murmurs followed. Some of the men paused mid-conversation. One or two women peered through the windows. Someone asked who built it. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her hands, stained and strong, spoke louder than words. She returned home that afternoon, parked the vehicle beneath the shade of the only tree that still bloomed on her land, and stood there beside it, arms crossed, lips pressed into a line of satisfaction. For once, she didn't feel like she had to prove anything. The machine was proof enough. She leaned against the frame, still warm from the ride, and for a long while, she just listened to the wind move through the corn like an old friend humming a tune only she could hear. Years passed in the same quiet way seasons change in a town like Willow Creek, slowly, deliberately, like time was reluctant to let go of what it knew. Leela Mae Dawson kept her head down and her hands moving, and in doing so, she stitched herself into the very soil of the place that once tried to spit her out. Her land changed before the town did. The wildflowers crept further up the fences. The porch sagged a little deeper into the earth, and the shed out back had grown into something closer to a proper workshop. It had taken years to add the tin roof, to reinforce the beams, to install proper lighting from salvaged fixtures found on job sites she'd bartered her way onto. But little by little, her world expanded, not upward like buildings in a city, but outward like roots looking for water. The vehicle she built, the one that had roared to life in her backyard and carried her across forgotten roads, wasn't the end of her work. It was the beginning. Word had spread not in a wave, but in ripples. Farmers talked. Loggers passed her name down trails of cigarette smoke and radio static. A rancher from the next county over drove in one dusty afternoon, asking if she could build something like what she drove, only stronger. "I've got 20 head and no patience for repairs every month," he'd said. She nodded and went to work, not needing much more than his list of complaints and a handshake. That second machine rolled out of her shop 6 months later, and by the time it reached his property, 2 more requests had followed. She didn't build for speed or for style. She built for the kind of people who didn't have time for breakdowns and couldn't afford replacements. Her vehicles weren't beautiful, but they were brave. They bore the marks of her work, uneven paint where she ran out and had to mix her own, welded seams so thick they looked like scars, wheels that seemed carved from the earth itself. And with every machine she built, another piece of herself clicked into place, as though she had been waiting her whole life to become exactly this version of herself. She no longer walked into town pushing a wheelbarrow. That old wooden thing still lived, tucked beside the shed, half covered in ivy, the wheel rusted stiff from disuse. She didn't throw it away. How could she? That wheelbarrow had carried more than bolts and tools. It had carried heartbreak, carried belief, carried the weight of her silence. Some mornings, when the sun cast long shadows and her breath came slow from sleep, she'd step outside and glance at it, not with sadness, but with reverence. It was part of her story, a chapter written in rust. Now she had a flatbed truck built from scratch and a custom trailer for hauling parts. No decals, no company name on the side. Just dull gray paint and tires built to take a beating. She still wore the same type of overalls, still tied her hair back with the same strip of cloth, though it was now frayed at the edges and lighter in color from so many washings. Her hands had become her signature. Calloused, strong, lined with faint burn scars and grease stains no soap could lift. And when people came by, strangers at first, then neighbors, she greeted them with a nod and got to work. She didn't waste breath selling herself. Either you believed she could fix it, or you took your problem elsewhere. Her calendar filled slowly. She never took more than she could handle. She'd seen what overworking did to folks in town, how it hollowed them out from the inside. She preferred to go slow, build with care, and make each project something she could stand behind. But even as her reputation grew, she kept her world small. She didn't go to church, didn't visit the town square on Saturdays. She stayed on her land, among her tools and sketches and machines, where things made sense, and people didn't pretend then they were better than they were. Her voice, when she did speak, had grown steadier, less apologetic. She still wasn't one for long conversations, but when she spoke, folks leaned in. Because you don't ignore the woman who pulled herself out of the mud with nothing but a wrench and her will. One summer, a young woman named Jody showed up at Lila's gate, barefoot, sunburned, with a busted dirt bike in the bed of her borrowed pickup. She couldn't have been older than 20, and her eyes held the same kind of raw determination Lila recognized from her own reflection years ago. "They said you'd help me if it was worth fixing," Jody said, wiping sweat from her brow. Lila didn't ask who they were. She simply walked to the truck, looked over the engine, and said, "Leave it here. Come back in 3 days." When Jody returned, the bike sat upright under the lean-to, polished, reassembled, and roaring like something wild. Lila handed her the keys without ceremony. Jody stared at her a moment longer than most do, then said, "How'd you learn all this?" Lila shrugged. "You don't need school when you've got a good ear and no other choice." Jody didn't laugh, but something in her face softened. That moment, small and fleeting, carved itself into Lila's memory. Not because of the gratitude, but because of what it meant. A seed had been planted. A sign that maybe the work she'd done wasn't just saving herself, but reaching someone else too. After Jody, others came, not many. Just a handful of girls and women who'd heard about the woman with the quiet eyes and the iron hands. Some came to watch, some came to learn. Lila didn't advertise. She didn't hold workshops or write things on chalkboards. She just let them stand beside her, and if they paid attention, she handed them a tool. One by one, they began to understand that knowledge didn't always come in lectures. It came in rhythm. The clink of metal, the hiss of a torch, the precise pressure of a turning bolt. Lila didn't teach with words. She taught through motion, through patience, through silence earned. And through all of this, the machines, the learning, the solitude, Brent Callahan's name never passed her lips again. She had burned that chapter so thoroughly it might have never existed, and yet, in small ways, reminders surfaced. Once, while buying welding rods from a supplier 2 towns over, she saw a photo tacked to the wall behind the register. There he was, older, fuller in the face, leaning beside a second-hand truck with Marcy Lane on his arm, both of them looking more tired than they had any right to be. The clerk noticed her staring and said, "Oh yeah, Brent. He comes by every now and then, selling whatever he can. Lost his last shop. Shame, really." Lila didn't say a word, just paid for her rods and left. The wind outside was sharp that day, biting through her sleeves, but she didn't feel it. She only felt a kind of peace she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not pride, just peace. The kind that comes when something you once thought would break you becomes nothing more than a passing glance on someone else's wall. She drove home with the radio off, window down, the hum of the tires on the road like a lullaby. When she reached her property, she parked by the shed, walked around back, and stood beneath the blooming dogwood tree that now arched over the old wheelbarrow. Its vines had crept up the handles and wrapped around the wheel like they were trying to hold it in place. She didn't disturb it, didn't touch it, just stood there for a long time, letting the quiet hold her. And when the breeze came, carrying the smell of iron and fresh earth, she smiled softly. Not because she had won, but because she had survived, and somewhere along the way, she'd stopped needing anyone to notice. It was an ordinary Tuesday when everything changed, the kind of day that passed in most towns without remark, sky flat and wide, air thick with the scent of cut hay, the distant drone of a tractor splitting the silence like a tired lullaby. Lila had just finished patching a cracked oil pan when the sound of unfamiliar tires rolled up her drive, crunching slow over gravel that hadn't been disturbed in over a week. She wiped her hands on her pants, cautious as always, and stood by the shed's open doors as a sleek navy blue car, foreign-made and far too polished for Willow Creek, came to a soft stop just beyond her trailer. The man who stepped out was tall, neat, everything about him ironed and measured, from the part in his hair to the shine on his shoes. He introduced himself as Thomas Whitaker, said he was passing through on his way to a meeting in the next county when his GPS rerouted him through town. His car had overheated, bad fan belt, he guessed. She didn't answer right away, just motioned for him to lift the hood. He talked a lot while she worked, asked how long she'd been fixing cars, where she learned to weld, whether she took on apprentices, what she thought of electric conversion kits. She didn't feed his curiosity with more than 2 or 3 words at a time, and still, he stayed. After half an hour, she had the belt replaced and the coolant flushed. When she started the engine, it purred better than it had probably since the factory floor. He stood there, eyebrows raised, hands on hips, and gave her the kind of look she hadn't seen in years, not one of surprise, but of consideration. Before leaving, he handed her a card she didn't ask for, told her if she ever wanted to build something beyond the boundaries of this town, he might be able to help. Lila didn't say thank you, didn't say anything at all. She waited until the car had disappeared down the road before she looked at the card. Heavy stock, embossed lettering. A name, a title, a company she'd never heard of. She slipped it into the top drawer of her workbench and didn't think about it again for 3 weeks. But time has a way of bending when change is waiting in the corner. The week after Whitaker left, the rains came. Long, slow ones at first, the kind that turn the earth soft and make the walls of sheds sweat. Then heavier, downpours that flooded the low roads and pulled paint from anything not protected by shelter. Lila worked by lantern light those days, wrapped in her father's old coat, rain pinging the roof above her like a metronome. Customers slowed, roads closed, and the creek near the south edge of town swallowed 2 pastures whole. Then the letters started coming. First, a formal invitation from a logistics company in Jefferson County. They'd heard of her from a contractor. Wanted to know if she'd be willing to consult on a project, something about durable engine design. She read it twice, folded it back into the envelope, and tucked it under her tools. The second came in a manila envelope, stamped with the name of an agricultural machinery distributor. They'd heard she built machines that didn't die in the field. They wanted to see them for themselves. Each letter spoke with a voice of politeness, but beneath the paper and ink, Lila could feel it. Opportunity knocking in a language that wasn't begging but bargaining. She didn't trust it, not right away. People in suits had never done her any favors. But she remembered the way Whitaker had looked at her workshop, not with pity, not with novelty, but with curiosity. That was rare. And curiosity, when tempered with respect, had always been the first brick in anything worth building. So she called him, not with excitement, not with nerves. Just calm, like one mechanic speaking to another. He answered on the second ring, voice just as clean and measured as she remembered. They set a meeting for 2 weeks later at a location that used to be a textile mill and had since been converted into an innovation space, whatever that meant. She didn't dress up for it, wore what she always wore. Drove one of her own machines, slow and steady down the highway, each mile humming like a thread being pulled towards something unfamiliar. The building was all steel and glass, nothing like Willow Creek. Lila stood out before she even stepped inside, boots caked in mud, denim faded by sun and work. But the room they brought her into was quiet and spare, and when she set down her schematics, hand-drawn, smudged with fingerprints, they didn't laugh. They asked questions, real ones. She explained her torque distribution system, how her frame design minimized vibration across uneven terrain, how she used recycled parts, not out of necessity, but because she believed machines deserved a second life. Whitaker watched her the way you watch someone tune an instrument you don't know how to play. She left with nothing but words and handshakes, and still, something had shifted. 3 months later, she received an offer. Not a job, an investment, her name on the paperwork. Full ownership. They'd help her scale up, move production to a proper facility, hire people, ship orders. They wanted the soul of what she made, just multiplied. She spent a week walking the perimeter of her land before she answered. Took long walks through the woods behind her shed, let the wind speak and the trees listen. This was the kind of decision that needed silence. She signed the contract with a steady hand and returned home to start building blueprints. Not for another vehicle, but for a future. She chose a location 2 counties over, far enough from Willow Creek that no one would bump into her by accident, but close enough that she could still drive the back roads when she missed the way her tires felt on dirt. Her name, Lila M. Dawson, was welded into a steel sign above the entry gate. No ribbon cutting, no press release. Just one hard-earned name on a gate that would open wide for workers, builders, thinkers, and all those who knew what it meant to shape something with their hands. Even after the first orders were filled, even after the small team she hired began referring to her as boss, Lila refused to stay behind a desk. She kept her hands dirty, checked every build personally, tested prototypes on her own time. She insisted on walkthroughs, on speaking to fabricators by name, on making sure every part that left her facility had passed through human eyes before it found its way into the world. She was offered a chance to speak at expos, to sit on panels, to be photographed and profiled, but she turned all of it down. She didn't need the noise. What she needed was focus. She worked like the machines she built, deliberate, reliable, never wasting motion. She paid her crew well, kept the doors open to women looking for a path in an industry that never made room for them. Her workers came from all corners, some trained, some not, but every one of them learned her methods. Respect the process, trust the material, and never, ever cut corners. Her company grew slowly, like everything in her life had. Steady and sure, shaped not by investors' hunger, but by her own quiet measure of what was right. And through it all, she returned to Willow Creek only when she needed peace. Her land remained untouched, her shed locked tight, the wheelbarrow still asleep beneath the dogwood. She never moved away entirely, because the place that broke her had also built her. And now, when she passed through town, no one laughed. Some didn't recognize her at all. Others looked away, unsure if they should speak. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't offer bitterness. She just kept driving. It had been nearly a year since the first order rolled out of her new facility when the letter from Willow Creek arrived, tucked in a brown envelope and sealed with the town's official crest, 2 wheat stalks crossing under a rising sun, faded and familiar. Lila recognized the clerk's looping cursive before she even slid it open, and she stood by her kitchen window a long moment before unfolding the paper. Inside was an invitation, formal, overworded, and cautious. The town council was requesting her presence at a community investment session. Their tone was apologetic without ever using the word sorry. A proposal was enclosed, complete with graphs, goals, and desperate optimism dressed in municipal language. At first, Lila thought she might toss it straight into the trash. But something in the timing of it all made her stop. Willow Creek, the place that mocked her ambition, now wanted her help. It was hard not to feel the irony settle in her chest like warm tea laced with bitters. She read the letter again, slower this time, catching the phrases carefully stitched together: revitalize our community, support from successful locals, shared history. The pages smelled of the old government building where she'd once waited in line to renew a worn-out license plate, the same office where she'd overheard someone whisper her name in mockery. Yet now here they were whispering again, but this time for aid. She didn't smile, she didn't frown either. Just set the paper down and stared out the window at the stretch of land she still returned to when the world asked too much of her. The sky was overcast, the color of old tin, and the branches of the dogwood trembled in the wind as though they too remembered the weight of being unwanted. When she arrived back in Willow Creek, the road looked the same but felt different beneath her tires. The potholes were deeper now, the sidewalks cracked, paint faded on the store signs like someone had tried to erase history with time instead of apology. She drove slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because every corner whispered old stories she couldn't rush past. The diner still stood where it always had, though one of its front windows was boarded up. The church bell no longer rang on the hour. And the gas station had gone quiet, its pumps wrapped in yellow tape like they were relics of a better time. She parked near the old courthouse, not to be seen, but because the parking lot still had the most shade, and walked toward the council hall with her hands tucked in her pockets. Inside, the air was cool and dry, buzzing faintly with fluorescent lights and the nervous energy of people who knew they were asking for something they once denied. There were new faces, younger ones trying to smile like they hadn't heard the stories, and old ones who avoided her eyes because they had. Brent Callahan sat near the back, thinner than she remembered, his shirt tucked too tightly into his belt like he was trying to hold the years back. Marcy Lane sat beside him, her hair shorter now, her posture stiff, eyes tracing the room like she was scanning for someone to blame. Lila took her seat at the long table near the front where a printed name card sat waiting, Ms. Lila Dawson, Dawson Motors. She didn't touch it. She just folded her hands and listened. They spoke in turns, some awkward, some overly rehearsed, about the future of Willow Creek, about opportunity, about redemption in numbers. The words tumbled out, hopeful but hollow, and when the time came for Lila to speak, she did so quietly. She asked questions. Not cruel ones, not sharp, just real. Where would the money go? Who would oversee the renovations? What guarantees could they offer for transparency? And as she spoke, Brent's head tilted just slightly. Recognition flickered in his expression, not of her face, but of the woman he hadn't waited to know. When the meeting ended, hands were shaken and promises were floated like balloons without strings. Lila didn't linger. She stepped out into the sunlight, the wind catching her shirt, and walked past the faces that had once turned away from her. She felt them looking now, not with mockery, but with a quiet uncertainty, as if unsure whether to reach for her or stand back and let her pass. She returned home and spent 2 weeks weighing every proposal, reading between lines like she'd once read the rust in broken pistons. And when she made her decision, it was with clarity, not sentiment. She declined the offer, not out of vengeance, but out of principle. She sent the rejection letter with a simple, professional tone, no bitterness, no embellishment, just facts. Her signature sat at the bottom like a full stop at the end of a chapter she'd outgrown. Brent and Marcy received their own copies as part of the packet. Lila knew that. She didn't imagine their reactions. She didn't picture Brent unfolding the letter, didn't think about Marcy's silence across the kitchen table. That part of her life was no longer open for edits. What mattered now was the boundary she had drawn, the quiet line between then and now. When she returned to her facility, her crew greeted her with nods and updates, steel shipments, completed builds, new requests. She nodded back, sleeves already rolled, the past folded into her back pocket like a forgotten map. And later that evening, long after the welders powered down and the yard emptied, she stepped into her workshop and sat in the silence. The same way she used to when everything felt heavy. The same way she did when everything finally made sense. It was late when she drove back to the cottage in Willow Creek, the only piece of land she refused to sell, the one place where memory lived in roots and rust. The dogwood tree had grown thicker, branches wide enough to offer full shade now, petals scattered like pale confetti along the ground. The wheelbarrow remained in its corner, vines laced through the spokes like time had tried to braid itself into her past. She didn't move it, didn't clean it up. She sat beside it on the ground, boots pressed to the soil, eyes on the stars that blinked slowly in the ink above. The wind carried the scent of rain from the west, and somewhere far off, a frog croaked once and went silent. She spoke only one word, quiet, nearly a whisper. Enough, not to herself, not to the town, just to the past. It was enough now. She had carried it long enough, pulled its weight like a second shadow, and somewhere between the laughter that broke her and the machines she built from nothing, she had outlived it. There was no parade for her pain, no song sung for her rise, but that was how she liked it. Her victory didn't need an audience. It only needed truth. And as she leaned back against the trunk of the dogwood, fingers brushing the rim of the wheelbarrow that had once held her whole world, she let the silence do the celebrating. No need for applause. The wind was enough. The years that followed passed like brushstrokes on a wide, quiet canvas, slow, deliberate, and full of color that didn't always shout but never faded. Lila Mae Dawson grew older, not in the way some people do with aching bones and bitter memories, but like a tree does, stronger in the trunk, calmer in the wind. Her company didn't become a household name. That had never been her intention. But in the circles that mattered, in the farms that fed towns, in the counties where dust ruled the roads, in the mouths of workers who needed more than sales talk, Dawson Motors became something more than a brand. It became a lifeline. Her machines rolled over the land like quiet sentinels, dependable and unbothered, each one carrying the soul of her early struggle, forged in those lonely nights by lantern light. She spent less time now sketching blueprints and more time walking the factory floors, not with authority, but with presence. She asked about people's children, handed out hand-welded tools she still made by habit, and fixed the occasional loose bolt with her own fingers just to remind herself she still could. There were lines in her face now that hadn't been there before, soft creases earned from years of sun, sweat, and silence. She wore them without apology. If she caught her reflection in a pane of glass, she didn't look away. She didn't straighten her back or fix her hair. She simply acknowledged the woman who stared back with a nod, as one would greet an old friend on a porch after many winters apart. Her cottage in Willow Creek remained untouched, the last stubborn memory of the girl who once pushed a wheelbarrow through town like it held the weight of her entire heart. The roof had been patched but not replaced, the walls repainted only once in all those years, and the furniture remained as mismatched as it had always been, none of it fashionable, but all of it familiar. She didn't keep much. A few framed photographs, a box of handwritten notes from workers past and present, and her father's old cassette tapes, which she still played sometimes when the evenings felt too still. The shed out back had been cleared of rust and overgrowth, but the wheelbarrow remained, half swallowed by time, like a monument too humble to announce itself. Visitors occasionally came to see her. Some were women who had heard stories, not from articles or documentaries, but from mothers and aunts and sisters who once stood quietly beside her, holding tools with unsteady hands. Others were people who had driven her machines across mountain passes or down forgotten roads, and wanted to meet the woman who had built something that never quit. She welcomed them all the same, offered tea if they didn't mind it strong, and stories if they stayed long enough to earn them. She spoke sparingly about the past, but if someone asked about the wheelbarrow, she'd smile and say, "That thing carried more than tools. It carried me." No one ever laughed. Not anymore. They listened, and in their silence was a kind of reverence, the quiet awe reserved for relics that changed the course of something invisible. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind slipped between the gaps in the window panes and the frogs in the creek croaked like old men swapping secrets, Lila would sit outside on the porch with a blanket over her knees and her boots propped on the rail. She didn't think much about Brent or Marcy or the council that once asked her to help fix what they had let rot. Those people had faded like faces in an old photograph, important once, but no longer able to touch the present. What stayed with her instead were the echoes of smaller moments, the first time she started an engine built from nothing, the spark of belief she saw in a young girl's eyes when handed her first wrench, the smell of hot metal and pine during those long summer builds. She remembered the silence of the shed before her business had a name, and how that silence had spoken more clearly than any crowd. She remembered the taste of exhaustion after a 14-hour day, and how it always came mixed with pride. And she remembered the softness of her mother's hands when she braided her hair, the rhythm of her father's breathing when he napped under the hood of a truck, and how even loss had shaped her, not as a wound, but as a mold. She didn't believe in legacy the way others did, as a story printed in books or honored in ceremonies. For her, legacy lived in the doing, in the bolts tightened with care, in the knowledge passed without fanfare, in the strength to keep showing up when no one is watching. The final machine she ever built was not for sale. It wasn't designed to haul or climb or carry any burden heavier than memory. She built it slowly over the course of 2 quiet winters, in the shed behind the cottage where it all began. The frame was old, repurposed from one of her early prototypes, but the lines were clean, the welds precise. It didn't roar when it started, it hummed. The engine sounded like a deep breath taken before a promise. She painted it herself, not with company colors or branding, but with the same shade of blue her mother used to wear on Sundays. The tires were reinforced, though it would never see the road. It wasn't built for that. It was built to hold everything she couldn't carry anymore: old tools, unused sketches, journals, and the first bolt she ever turned with her father beside her. When she finished, she didn't display it or photograph it. She simply rolled it into the backfield where the land sloped gently toward the woods, and left it there, like a stone at the edge of a river. It would stay there long after she was gone, not as a monument, but as a reminder. It's something built with love and labor doesn't need applause to be remembered. It simply needs to exist, and so it did, quietly, faithfully, like she had.